When I was a kid, before we moved to Ohio, we lived in a house with a huge backyard in North Carolina, and that space made me feel like the luckiest kid in the neighborhood. Every time we wanted to play outside, my backyard was the perfect place. We had almost 2 acres of land surrounded by trees on 3 sides, an old shed in one corner, a swing, and a small basketball court. There was so much space that we could play any sport, soccer, baseball, even football. We also loved playing games like hide and seek or manhunt, as we called it. One Friday night, when we were in middle school, my friends and I decided to have a different kind of sleepover. We would spend the night outside in the old shed. With me were Daniel, Matt, and Chris. Of course, we had to get permission from our parents, but it wasn't a problem. We were 11 or 12 years old, it was Friday, and there was no reason to say no. Plus, my family had plenty of camping gear, so we had enough sleeping bags and flashlights. After getting the green light from our parents, we agreed to meet at my house around 5 in the afternoon so we could play for a while before dinner. Our backyard had 2 old soccer goals we always used. We started with a 2-on-2 match that lasted about half an hour. Then we switched to baseball for a bit. After catching our breath for a few minutes, my parents ordered pizza for us. We ate around 6:30 or 7, I think. By then, the sun was starting to set, and it was time to set up the shed for the night. I was pretty good at these things because I had been camping several times with my dad. My friends helped, but in the end, I did most of the work. When everything was ready, it was almost dark. The backyard lights were on, creating a perfect atmosphere. Now it was time to play manhunt. The yard had plenty of hiding spots. We played in teams. Matt and I hid while Daniel and Chris searched for us. Matt and I split up. The goal was to make it back to the safe zone, which was the patio behind the house. We couldn't just stay hidden near it. I sneaked behind the shed, where some old crates were stacked. When I heard the whistle signaling the start of the hunt, I stayed still, watching my friends move in the distance. I waited for the right moment to get closer to the patio. I had my eye on an old rocking chair near the house. If I could reach it, I could make a final sprint to the door. When I saw Daniel and Chris turn in the opposite direction, I ran toward the chair and crouched behind it. That's when I heard a noise. A metallic thud. Then I saw the motion sensor light turn on next to the garage. It couldn't have been one of my friends. I peeked past the chair and saw a tall figure dressed in dark clothes walking quickly toward the woods. It wasn't my dad. I jumped up, ran to my friends, and told them the game was over. We rushed inside to tell my dad. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check for a few minutes, even looking down the street, but found nothing unusual. He said it might be better if we slept inside. We were disappointed, but we agreed. We started playing PlayStation in the living room. I told my friends again what I had seen, a tall man walking away after nearly knocking over a trash can. After a while, we started thinking maybe we were just imagining things. Our sleeping bags were already outside, and the shed was set up. What were the chances that guy was still out there? Hours later, when the house was quiet, we decided to go back outside. We tried not to make noise so we wouldn't wake my dad. We weren't hiding anything, but we didn't want to be stopped either. Matt and I shared one corner of the shed, while Daniel and Chris settled on the other side. After some chatting and joking, we started calming down and trying to sleep. I was still awake, but it seemed like Matt had dozed off. That's when I heard footsteps in the grass. They were getting closer. Then I heard the zipper of the shed being pulled open. I looked up, thinking it was my dad. The man said, "What are you guys doing out here?" I instinctively replied, "They wanted to sleep here, so we came back." Then I looked at his face more closely. It wasn't my dad. It was a stranger. A man in his 50s, his face partially lit by the flashlight he held. He leaned slightly toward us, as if about to step inside. I screamed at the top of my lungs. Matt woke up instantly and screamed too. The man grabbed our ankles and whispered for us to be quiet. But he quickly realized it wasn't going to work. He let go and ran away. I told my friends to run into the house. As we ran toward the back door, my dad was already there, woken by our screams. I quickly told him everything. The man from earlier was back. My dad grabbed a stick and ran around the yard, shouting insults and daring the man to come back. We could hear him yelling from the living room window. My mom called the police. When they arrived, the officer took my statement and wrote a report. He said they'd keep an eye out for any suspicious activity in the area. I don't know if that man ever came back or if he was caught for something similar. But that night was terrifying. And it could have ended much worse. This was a few years ago, in 2019. I was at a friend's house. Let's call her Sarah for the sake of the story. I was really excited for this sleepover. I couldn't wait to talk about all the middle school drama. Now, something you might want to know is that Sarah's house was deep in the woods. I mean, really deep. No matter where you looked, there were woods, and their nearest neighbor was about a half-mile away. But behind her house, there was a cliff that led down to the ocean. The evening at Sarah's house started off pretty well. Our friend Emily was there too. We played truth or dare, hide and seek, and other teenage games. It was getting pretty late, but we decided to go for a walk down the gravel road that led to other houses nearby. We asked her mom, and she said yes. So, we started walking. After another 10 to 15 minutes, we saw a man walking on the other side of the street toward us. At first, we didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just out for an evening walk, too. But what didn't seem right was that this man was wearing thick clothing, almost like winter gear, and it was warm out at that moment, around 60 degrees. We all exchanged glances as we passed by the man, and that's when it hit us, the smell. The disgusting stench coming from him. It was unbearable. Words can't describe how gross it was. It was so bad that after we finally walked a few feet away, Emily took a deep breath, almost like she had been holding it in. One of my friends ran off into the woods, nearly throwing up. At that point, we decided it was best to head back. Our friend who almost threw up kept begging to go back. We all agreed, so we turned around. As we walked back, we passed him again. This time, we held our breath as we walked by. But when we looked back, we saw he wasn't walking in the opposite direction anymore. Instead, he was following us. The disgusting smell was getting closer. We had no choice but to pick up the pace. We started walking faster. We still had about a mile to go before we got back to Sarah's house. As we increased our pace, so did the man. We looked at each other, scared and frustrated. We began to jog, but of course, he sped up, too. At this point, we were running, and Emily looked back, and that's when we heard it. Emily let out a blood-curdling scream, which made Sarah and me turn around. What we saw still horrifies me to this day. The man was sprinting toward us. He had something that looked like a knife or some sharp object in his hand. Emily and I screamed as we ran down the road, and our screams seemed to make him stop chasing us. He just stood there, staring as we ran away. We didn't stick around to find out what his intentions were. We just ran straight back to Sarah's house. Once we got back, we slammed the door shut and decided not to tell her parents since they were already asleep. We all went into the living room to finish setting up our sleeping areas. A few hours passed, and it was about 2 a.m. by now. We were watching something, I can't remember what, but it was a horror movie. Now, I mentioned that Sarah's house was on a cliff for a reason. Because of this, her house had a lot of windows in the back, overlooking the view. I was sitting on one of the couches, right by the window. It was pitch black outside. All we could hear were the waves and the occasional wind. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside. They sounded like they were right by the window. I told my friends, and Sarah said it was probably the deer that always comes by. For the past 2 years, Sarah had been feeding this deer, and it always came to the very window. I got excited, thinking the deer would come right up to my hand. I decided to look outside, but I didn't see anything. It was too dark. I suggested we go outside to pet the deer, but Sarah and Emily said no. They reminded me of what had happened earlier, and I agreed. So we went back to watching the movie. Another hour passed, and we were all feeling tired. We turned off the TV and headed under our blankets. About 45 minutes later, Sarah and Emily were fast asleep, but I couldn't rest. Something felt off. I had this gut feeling telling me not to go to sleep, so I decided to look outside. The moon was just bright enough that I could see the ocean. I spent a few minutes staring out, when suddenly something moved in the woods to the left. I turned my head to that direction, but saw nothing. I was sure I saw movement, so I grabbed a flashlight from the bookshelf and pointed it toward where I saw the movement. Now this was probably the worst idea I could have ever had, because when I did so I saw that man again, but this time he didn't have any snow gear on. Instead, he was completely shirtless, and I wasn't about to find out what else he didn't have on, so I tried to wake up Sarah and Emily and tell them what I saw. Emily woke up, but Sarah was a deep sleeper. I told Emily to look outside, but when we looked, he was gone. Emily looked at me with a pretty angry expression, like I was just messing with her. I told her I wasn't, but she didn't believe me. She went back to bed, and I was left laying there. It was now about 4:30 in the morning. It was still dark outside. I didn't sleep at all. I felt myself drifting off to sleep when I heard a knock on the door. I almost jumped off the couch when I heard it. I knew I shouldn't open it, but my curiosity got the best of me. I walked over to the door and looked out of the peephole, and again, I saw nothing. My head had to be playing with me. I again went back to the couch and threw my blanket over my head. I eventually fell asleep, but woke up at around 5 a.m. in a cold sweat. Something wasn't right again, my body wouldn't stop shaking. Then it hit me, that familiar stench, that disgusting smell. I almost threw up right there. But as fast as I sat up, I heard footsteps coming towards me, and I screamed. I flicked on the flashlight, and as I did, I saw him, the man from earlier, standing in the corner of the room. I screamed. Sarah and Emily woke up, and they screamed too, and as we did this, the man bolted out of the house. Sarah's parents came running down the stairs, and after a few minutes, we told them everything that happened. Sarah's mom called the cops while Sarah's dad walked down the road with a shotgun to see if he could find the man. After that, once the police arrived and got all of our stories, I went home. My parents didn't tell me much when I got home. They hugged me for what felt like hours, and from that moment, I wasn't allowed at sleepovers anymore. Only now, years later, did I finally realize just how bad everything was. The police eventually found the guy, and inside that old shed we were daring each other to go into, were 5 dead bodies, and that stench that was on that man's body was the smell of decaying flesh. And if things didn't go the way they went in the end, Sarah, Emily, and I would have ended up in that shed. I work as a risk analyst for a large bank in Manhattan, and I've been lucky enough to meet many interesting people through this job. My colleagues and I often go for happy hour. In 2019, a new colleague, Mark, was transferred to our office. I met him on his first day. He seemed very sociable and talkative, always smiling and laughing. That Friday, he came with us to happy hour and turned out to be the most lively person, telling all his experiences and adventures around the world, with stories that seemed endless. Over time, Mark and I became friends and met up occasionally on weekends. However, the more I got to know him, the more I realized that many of his stories were exaggerations, maybe even made up. He often talked about the fascinating women he'd met and famous celebrities he'd socialized with, but I learned to take everything with a grain of salt. Still, I continued hanging out with him because he was fun and easily connected with everyone. One day, he invited me to spend a weekend with him and his sister at their beach house in Long Beach, California. Mark's mother was wealthy and owned houses in several cities, but she wouldn't be there that weekend. So, I decided to bring my brother Max along. We wanted to relax for a few days. We landed on the same flight and I met his sister at the airport. She seemed a bit eccentric, but nice. The beach house was really beautiful, a 2-bedroom apartment, perfect for our stay. Mark and his sister took a room each, while Max and I shared the second. Even though we arrived late, we decided to go out anyway. The area was full of beach bars, but the crowd was a little older and more mature. Mark, however, was getting drunk quickly, and I couldn't understand why he was drinking so much. Eventually, I had to stop him when he started getting too aggressive with people. I had never seen Mark like this. He tried talking to every girl he met, and almost all of them seemed annoyed by him. We started laughing about the situation, but soon it became uncomfortable. A big guy approached angrily, and despite my attempt to calm Mark down, he kept provoking him. I decided to intervene, apologizing and pulling us away. But Mark shoved me and yelled at me for not defending him. Max and I tried to calm him down, even his sister told him to relax, but Mark wouldn't listen. I think he went straight home. His sister said nothing and followed him. What had started as a promising night now seemed completely out of control. Max and I stayed to finish our drinks. When some girls came up and asked how we knew Mark, we joked with them, and we ended up exchanging numbers. They told us they were going downtown and invited us to join them. We agreed, and once back home, I tried texting Mark to find out where they were. He replied immediately, saying they had gone home. When we returned to our apartment, we expected Mark to be angry, but when we walked in, we found him sitting on the couch, with a huge smile, asking us, "Are we going out tonight?" He was clearly completely drunk. I told him it was better to stay home for a bit before going out. Then I told him about the girls and said they had asked about him. Mark asked how many girls, and when I told him 2, his smile disappeared. At that moment, Max, maybe joking, told him the girls had asked how we knew him. Mark, obviously annoyed, ran to his room, slamming the door. I started to think that Mark might have some psychological issues. The situation was starting to feel increasingly strange. I approached his sister and told her that Mark seemed really nervous, but she responded indifferently. It was clear she didn't want to talk about it. I felt the situation was getting uncomfortable, and I hoped that, as the hours passed, Mark would calm down. Max and I stayed in our room for a while. Mark didn't come out. When I went to knock on his door, I got no response. Eventually, we decided to go downtown to meet the girls. During the night, Mark sent me threatening messages saying we had left everything in the hallway and wouldn't be coming back home. The girls were also worried, and everyone kept asking what had happened. We knew the situation was escalating, but we didn't want to leave the night halfway through. When we came back home, Mark was sitting on the couch, staring at the wall, motionless. I asked him if he was okay, but he briefly looked at me and said, "I hope you had fun," then went back to his room. Max and I, at that point, couldn't understand what was going on. We stayed awake for a while, talking about the situation and trying to figure out what had happened to Mark. Then we heard footsteps outside our door. We stopped talking and waited for the situation to calm down. The footsteps stopped in front of the door, then we heard them move away, and after a few minutes, Mark went back to his room. We felt relieved and tried to sleep. Shortly after, I woke up, feeling a strange sensation. I looked toward the door and saw it slightly ajar. Mark was standing there, silently. I quickly got up and asked what he was doing. Without warning, he lunged at me, shouting incomprehensible phrases and trying to grab me. Max immediately reacted, stopping him and throwing him to the floor. Mark, furious, yelled that we were traitors and that we had talked behind his back. The situation had completely gotten out of hand. We decided to pack our bags and take a taxi to a hotel, where we spent the rest of the weekend. We returned home on Sunday, and in the following days, I didn't see Mark at the office. He avoided talking to me or even looking at me. Eventually, he transferred to another office, probably to avoid further contact with me. What seemed like a carefree trip had turned into a nightmare. Mark, although seeming friendly and normal at first, turned out to be a deeply unstable person, and that night will stay in my mind forever.